few people in here now, so I'll kick things off. So thank you very much, all three of you, for joining me on the call today. Really actually been looking forward to this over the past week, just to understand what each of your perspectives would be. I've been looking into some of the reasons why business would migrate and some of the reasons a business wouldn't. But yeah, first of all, if you want to, I'll hand over to you all to introduce yourself. If you want to start us off, Zhao, introduce yourself, a bit about your business and yourself.
Sure. So my name is João Rodrigues. I'm the head of cloud adoption at MobileLab. And essentially what we do at MobileLab within cloud adoption is helping large companies, large enterprises, moving their IT infrastructure into the cloud environment. This is the primary, I would say, reason why we are doing cloud adoption. But alongside this, we also help them leverage the other benefits of the cloud, which are plenty. There's all the self-servicing features that give agility to their developers, all the different security models, all the cloud governance, all the necessary architecture. So we help our customers take care of all of this.
Memo, do you want to introduce yourself to everyone?
Yes, hi. My name is Memo. I'm the head of infrastructure SRE department at Klar. So Klar is a bank in Mexico based. We have about now, I think, 1.5 million users. We started 2 years ago. My career has been explicitly around fintechs, early stage, starting with the cloud. I've worked also at Mercedes-Benz for a while, and they were at the phase of migrating to the cloud. And so the two worlds extremes. Yeah, definitely my experience goes around, especially now I've moved more into supporting also kind of a group of companies in which developing, so many values of migrating to clouds, whether it's public or private, but I'm very much interested in the DevOps SRE set part of how do we amplify your team speed, in which your SRE team would build its own abstraction layer. Like a cloud is basically an abstraction layer of REST APIs to control infrastructure. And at Klar, we built our own kind of product in which it's like kind of infrastructure as code, fully modularized, so that developers manage their own stuff without having to deal with complexities. And all over, it's about kind of also similar to my colleagues, but I'm more interested into how to amplify the speed of a team while also keeping the compliance side and security and governance side also up to speed.
And last but not least, Paul, if you're able to just introduce yourself to everybody, a bit about yourself and your business.
Of course, hopefully the office isn't too noisy. But my name is Paul Mcdonald. I'm currently Director of Cloud Engineering at a fintech called Allview. We primarily focus on the credit and equity markets in the product that we ship. Previous to this, I ran a platform and CI/CD team at WorldPay, and then previous to that, I was at Deutsche Bank doing a cloud transformation piece.
Okay, nice. So thank you very much, all of you, for introducing yourself. I'm going to just jump straight into it. Anyone who wants to answer this first. So if you're a small business and you're debating moving over to the cloud, what would you say one of the real benefits a business receives or a business gets once deciding to make the move to the cloud and migrating from on-prem to the cloud? What is one of the real benefits?
I think I can take this one. It depends on who you ask. If you ask the CFO or the CIO, right? The CFO will tell you about costs and will tell you about Apex versus Capex. And the CIO will tell you about security and infrastructure elasticity and how they can grow their IT much faster and meet demand on a much easier way. So it really depends on who you ask. But generally, these are the two things that I hear the most, which is really costs and speeds on deploying infrastructure.
Okay. And so with that, when you say costs, obviously, for me, I speak to a lot of people on a day-to-day basis who are considering moving to the cloud, and a lot of people think moving to the cloud is expensive, and in the long term costs them more money. Would you agree or disagree with that statement?
I think it's a bit of a catch-22 statement. If you migrate to the cloud and you go in cloud first, and like Mimo described, everything is as code, and you have a good SRE layer over top, and you've got FinOps running in there, then it can be an exceedingly cost-effective manner in which to run your infrastructure. I think if you go to the cloud and you transport your on-prem problems into the cloud, it's going to be more expensive, more bothersome, and it's going to cost you more time than you ever expected it would.
There's also one more factor.
Yeah, please.
There's also one more factor other than my colleagues shared, is actually like when you look for talent pool in the market, when you're running on the cloud, and specifically like mentioned a kind of growing company, I think also cloud adds to their profile, in which they say we're working with Kubernetes clusters. Something would be very hard to manage on premise. So yeah, I would add that.
Okay, yeah, no, I completely agree. I think it's important, and it also is a case-by-case basis. One thing I want to ask is, so a lot of businesses will also feel, other than cost, that there is risk of moving to the cloud. Some would say security, others would say loss of data. You're all obviously three professionals, very skilled within this field. So what would you say that the risks out there is more, or once you move to the cloud, it's worth it despite the risks? Or would you say it's better, if you're concerned about your security or loss of data, to stay on-prem?
I think this question stems from a very specific culture of infrastructure teams, where they always think their hardware is better than the others. They always think they do it better. They always think they're more secure. And that is I think blatantly untrue, in particular when you look at this cloud environment. So you have these infrastructure teams of 5, 10, maybe 20 people, and you want to compare the security of the work that they did with that of a hyperscaler that has tens of thousands of developers thinking about security or working on security issues. So I think that from a security perspective, the cloud gives you so much more tools that are already built into it to manage your security profile, to manage your security posture, that you would not necessarily have on premises. So from a risk perspective, I would think that the risk is not really true in a way. And if you manage things properly, you end up with a much more secure environment on the cloud than you'd have on premises.
Yeah, I'd completely agree with you on that. There's a lot more security built into it. It's just from the outside looking in, a lot of people see a lot about the cyber attacks at the moment. A lot of businesses getting ransom attacks. So I thought it'd be good to ask you that question, because I know for a lot of businesses that is one of the main things holding them back from migrating to the cloud, along with cost, which was another thing I mentioned. So for me, one of the things that I'd say, I think when a business is moving to the cloud, you can agree or disagree on this. I think one of the most important parts of it is to plan it properly. When businesses throw it upon themselves and they're not too sure, which cloud provider they're going to use, or when they're going to migrate to the cloud, if everything's going to go there, I feel like they land themselves in a position they wouldn't want to be in. What would you say one of the other common mistakes people make when deciding to move to the cloud is?
So the most common mistake I see is actually not thinking about governance before cloud architecture. So governance and cloud governance is essentially an iterative process where you think about the risks of moving into the cloud, and you think about how you're going to mitigate those. Which rules are you going to put in place that mitigates those risks? This should come before actual architecture and before actual implementation and before you actually start using it, which is not always the case.
Thank you. And Memo, what are your thoughts on that? What would you say one of the biggest problems businesses have when looking to migrate to the cloud is? Would you say it's the preparation, or?
It could be anything. However, from my experience, it's basically around, if you're already an existing business running your own on-premise servers, your team is equipped to deal with that. They approach things as a system administrator. One of the largest mistakes I see, if that team isn't complemented with an addition of somebody with cloud-based SRE DevOps experience. If that didn't happen and the team was trying to adopt the cloud, you may run into this situation where your perception of how infrastructure should work, how things should be deployed, is really a system administrator, and the tooling you use around it is similar. That could be also a kind of, you can go to the cloud without and pay the cost without really leveraging all the tools it may offer in terms of specifically like the speed and security you may offer. For example, like at Klar, speaking of governments, we kind of build this abstraction layer in which developers have full read access into monitoring systems and AWS, but no single person has this right access other than pipelines. And it's really related to how we use the tools, like all this Helm, Terraform, TerraGrant, combine them together into building that model. If we approach this in terms of system administrator, kind of, oh, let's skip this one manual and that one manual, we kind of end up losing all this governance and having to actually document a lot of processes and kind of go back to square one while paying the cost.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Paul, what would you say one of the biggest mistakes is for businesses who are looking to move to the cloud? You've obviously been at a few businesses yourself. So just from your experience, what are the mistakes you've seen, which of course give moving to the cloud this bad name it can get from a very small minority?
Yeah, in a way, it's basically overthinking it, but not putting enough emphasis on what the future state will be. So again, I think with a lot of cloud migrations, people can tend to look at it where it goes wrong as a bit of a lift and shift, as opposed to, again, like my fellow panelists have talked about, you know, you've got to think about what the cloud is. The cloud isn't necessarily just a VM. It's a set of APIs. So how do you interface with that set of APIs? And reality is, if you look at it from an infrastructure perspective, much as again was said, you don't want to treat the cloud as a data center. You know, you really want to get out of the way of your end user. Now, whether that be a set of developers, a set of operators, you know, you want to get out of their way as an infrastructure person. Your job really is to just ensure that they have a fantastic landing zone, that the security stance, that the policy is correct, that, you know, access, authorization, all of that is done so that they can get their job done. Where it goes wrong is if you put in too many boundaries, if you haven't set the security context correctly, if you, in effect, make it as difficult as being on-prem when you're in the cloud. That's where I think things start to go wrong. Again, I kind of said it in the beginning bit, but you know, if you bring your problems from an on-premise world into the cloud, they multiply and they just get much more expensive.
Yeah, I know you did touch on that earlier, actually. It's interesting to say that. Just slightly changing topic here. How have you seen the demand change? Obviously, you're all at very different businesses, you're within the technology space. How have you seen the demand for businesses looking to move to the cloud increase since the COVID and work from home? Because I personally have seen a lot more businesses actually looking to make the move. So how important is it that a business has got their cloud set up and their security capabilities, and they've enhanced their cloud capabilities when they're working in a work from home model? Just start with Memo, if you don't mind.
I don't know about the increase since COVID. I haven't been looking at charts. However, back basically to square one, it has all the tools. It's already like a public cloud with many hundreds of thousands of servers across data centers, and it's already built into work kind of remotely and manage it remotely. So with on-premise infrastructure, you have to think about, again, maybe a VPN access. How do you manage that? And make sure that people remotely working have a secure connectivity. Then two-factor authentication, including all of these combined.
Sorry, all about the background noise. Sachin, we can all hear you. If you don't mind putting yourself on mute.
Sorry, mate. Sorry.
Thank you. And Paul, what about yourself? Have you seen? Obviously, I know you're not actively always looking for people, but have you seen the demand change for people who can help you migrate to cloud and for businesses looking to migrate to the cloud and move over since COVID has come into play and since work from home became part of our modern day life?
Yeah, I mean, look, so I think the quick and easy answer is it's increased. I think the more nuanced answer is kind of why has it increased? And it's really, I think it's all about agility. So if I kind of look at, I left Deutsche Bank just as the pandemic hit. And in reality, if they were looking to spin something up on-prem, the lead time for kit acquisition, et cetera, was going to be kind of 6 months. Then you got to have internal people route it, network it, et cetera. And then it kind of falls into the BAU aspect. Kind of compare that to an AWS, an Azure, a GCP, an Ali Cloud. You can essentially have all of that set up in the matter of minutes by running a pipeline. So from that aspect, yes, I kind of have seen a lot more people turn to the cloud. We personally, within Allview, have started making use of remote desktoping in the cloud because it's easy. We spin it up, we spin it down. We've got everything ready when we need it. We've got alerts and watches on it so that we cost optimize when not in use, et cetera. That's much more economical than shipping a laptop halfway across the world. So, that's a very specific instance of, where a kind of a real world IT problem gets solved in the cloud.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, it has been a real change. The fact you don't have to send out a laptop it saves a lot of time. It helps get people set up remotely. Just to go back to something you said there, actually, you mentioned about different cloud technologies, Ali, AWS, GCP, Azure. I'm not sure if you've worked with all of them, but I know right now you're not working at a consultancy and this isn't something you decide, but how would you advise a business on what cloud technology to choose out of, let's say, AWS, Azure, and GCP? Because this is something which I find quite interesting, and I would like to know all of your thoughts on this. How would you decide for a business? Would you always choose one, or would you say it depends on the size and the amount of users?
I mean, it's a very good question. There's no magic bullet for it. I think depending on the size of the business, depending on your internal skill set in the business, one of the major driving factors isn't got to be, who's going to help build out this cloud. So if you're looking at internal hires, you would say AWS, because actually they've had the greatest market penetration for the longest time. The vast majority of cloud engineers will have some experience in AWS. That'll be followed by Azure, followed by GCP. At a base layer, everybody can do a little something if they're a cloud engineer. Where the nuances come is actually when you look at the complexity of your application. So for instance, I would say one of the major determining factors are, what are you going to run in the cloud? Are you looking at any particular service that has a certain piece of IP that differentiates it in the AI space, in the database space? In effect, also, what region in the world are you serving? So certain cloud providers have better footprints in certain regions, and so therefore, dependent on where you need to have data sovereignty, you may look at that. Again, kind of without speaking to a very specific use case, it's rather difficult. But for the majority of businesses, the entry cloud is AWS, because a lot of people know how to use it. And its barrier to entry is small. I think as you kind of go up that scale and you start to, if you're a Citibank or a Deutsche Bank and you're doing a massive enterprise transformation, those cloud providers are going to throw money at you. They're going to say, come to our cloud. We will essentially pay you to run on it. And that's a completely different conversation entirely.
Yep. Thank you very much. It's pretty much what I was thinking. I do see AWS as an entry level. Zhao, what would you always advise on a particular cloud technology? Do you have a preference when it comes to choosing what cloud you work in, and why is that? If you're currently on mute, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. So I do agree to a certain extent that it depends on the number of factors, particularly on the know-how. But I also agree that it depends on what it is, the infrastructure that you're migrating, and what do you want from that infrastructure. As an example, the vast majority of the European customers that we have, they are heavily leveraged on Windows technologies and Microsoft technologies. For this, we always recommend Azure. If you want to have Windows virtual desktops, if you want to have SQL servers, Azure is your best bet, particularly because you can reuse your on-premises licenses. Now, if you're on a more Linux-friendly environment, if you're on a more, data-centric, if you have a lot of developers, then AWS and GCP starts making a bit more sense, right? So it always comes down to what it is that you're going to be doing with the cloud, what it is that are your needs, and what do you already have on premises. This is generally what we look into. Know-how is very important, but if you're a business that's just starting to adopt the cloud, you generally are only going to have one, maybe two people who know a bit about the cloud, but the vast majority would need to be upskilled anyway.
Perfect, thank you. It's good to get the second opinion on that. And finally, Memo, what was your preference, and at what times would you advise a business to choose a particular cloud platform?
I think everything has been said, so maybe I may add it's really about compliance. For example, if you go in Germany specifically, for example, if you go into health sector, compliance issues really will be a deciding factor, sometimes a preventing factor. But I think my colleagues have said everything that I would also think about on picking an environment. And AWS would be the kind of entry choice if a company doesn't already have like all this licensing, whether it being also limitations on where are the data centers. You also have, like, in terms of how many people in the market you can hire, AWS would be, I think, on the top.
Yeah, I completely agree. For me, when going to hire for businesses like yourself, AWS, I always do tend to find there is more people available. Just touching on that point, I know your business is actually hiring at the moment, Memo. How have you seen? How have you found recruiting since the demand for people within the cloud space has increased? Has it become more difficult? What problems are you having right now, if any,
Yeah,
of course?
Hiring, I'm involved in, have been involved in, I used to be backend in the same company. For SRE is getting far worse than it already was a year ago. Yeah, the talent pool has been really wiped out clean, but yeah, it's difficult. It's very difficult. Also, it's something debatable whether a company startup stage should go for AWS with all the blows and whistles with Kubernetes and then integrate it with Istio. I guess, yeah, when choosing also technologies after you pick the cloud, one also have to consider the hiring, because by now it's a huge problem.
It's actually really interesting to hear. Paul, what about yourself? Do you think of course it's become more difficult, but would you choose a cloud technology based upon the skills available in the market? And what difficulties have you had when it comes to recruiting recently within this space?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, no, we wouldn't choose a cloud based on the skills. I think Zhao kind of laid it out. I mean, for instance, within the organization currently, we have that exact situation where part of the business is heavily leveraged on Microsoft products. And so therefore, we run part of it in Azure and we run the other part in AWS. The biggest issue facing us with recruiting is A, access to great candidates, and B, access to candidates who haven't just done a little bit of training, but have actually put it into action. So essentially, you don't want somebody who can just run a script. You want somebody who understands why that script exists. You know, you want somebody who can think outside of the box. You want a lot of things in a cloud candidate, and that's half the problem. Is that, you know, it's such a wide-ranging section of the market. Are you talking about build activities? Are you talking about run activities? Are you talking about optimize SRE activities? You know, are you talking about this kind of, you know, FinSec ops? Are you talking about this bridging infrastructure DevOps role that isn't that classic kind of DevOps role that there is? You know, are you looking for people who, like Memo said, build a platform and abstraction layer above the cloud in order to make the life of developers easier in the internal pool? So it's incredibly difficult, and it's time consuming as well. You can have an in-person fit interview when you chat it through and you're like, yeah, you know, on paper and in person, I like this. I like what they're doing. They understand the basic concepts. And you throw them into a big technical interview and they pass that technical interview. And then you get them in the office and suddenly the business's direction changes. And now the question is, can that candidate change with the business? And so, you know, yes, there's lots of roles, there's a decent pool of generic candidates out there, but, you know, always the biggest problem with finding anybody is, are they going to be right for the business long term?
Yeah, this is very, very good point. That I face these issues a lot on the day-to-day myself. Zhao, what issues have you faced when it comes to bringing in tech talent with the current demand for cloud specialists?
So I think it's difficult to get tech talent across the board. It's not just necessarily in the cloud. But what I think the cloud has that other things they don't really have is that it's very new. And because it's very new, I believe that there is a big language problem when it comes to cloud-based roles. So if you think about a backend developer or a backend engineer, everyone knows exactly what a backend engineer does and what the backend engineer is. And every candidate can put himself in the role of a backend engineer or not, depending on his skills. But when it comes to cloud engineering or a cloud engineer position, it is not immediately clear whether or not a candidate is a cloud engineer for himself, because a few years ago, a cloud engineer would be called a DevOps engineer or an infrastructure engineer. Cloud engineers weren't really a thing. Now we have this role of cloud engineering, but you know, what really is it? What is it doing? And I'm sure, like in my company, a cloud engineer is going to do wildly different things than if they were in a different company, maybe in Paul's company. So there's a language problem, and we are trying to find cloud engineers. And the cloud engineers out there, they do not know that they are cloud engineers. So I've had a lot of luck in asking for DevOps engineers and saying that it's more an infrastructure oriented and less, you know, CI/CD and build pipelines. And after talking to the candidates and explaining the role a little bit, yeah, it's kind of DevOpsy, purely on infrastructure, purely on the cloud. And they can start seeing themselves as the role of a cloud engineer. And if I didn't went down that road, they would immediately have looked over this job ad, because they're not cloud engineers, they're DevOps engineers.
Yeah, that's another great point. It's something I was going to say myself. I think one of the difficulties I find when helping businesses with cloud talent is the term DevOps engineer is thrown about to quite a lot of different businesses. For some, what is a developer who works in a cloud capacity will call themselves a DevOps engineer. And likewise, some third line, fourth line infrastructure engineers do exactly the same. So I think one of the biggest difficulties is understanding a business's actual need, because as you said, at Paul's business, it may be completely different to yours. Obviously, working in the cloud, this is going slightly off topic, but do you engage with people who work fully remote then? Are you open to this remote working? Could somebody work from a different country? I know we're based all over Europe on this call, but would you take someone on Zhao as an example who's based in the UK, in Spain? Is that something you'd consider as a business, or?
So yes, we do work with remote people. Yes, that some specific situations we do have remote people. I think particularly with COVID, everyone is used with working with some level of remote work. But also, I always like to say that I like to work with friends more than just colleagues, and to create a level of personal relationship with your colleagues, being fully remote is extremely difficult. So I do prefer to work with hybrid models of working where we're in the office, like maybe a couple of times a month, 3 times a month, maybe a couple of times a week. I do heavily prefer that because I'm an office person myself.
Yeah. Paul, I can see you're an office person. You currently in the office. So what's your thoughts on this? Because we obviously make it easier for people to work remotely with the work we all do. You move to the cloud, so you have access to people all over the world. You can work from anywhere. Do you, as a business, do you take people on from all over the world, or?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I'm going to kind of echo exactly what Zhao just said. Me personally, I like to see people, and I mean, the big thing with kind of coming back to the office is that you now start to put a body onto a face. Whereas before, during the beginning of COVID, it was putting a face onto a voice before people learned to turn on their cameras. So yes, essentially our business supports a hybrid model. I mean, I've got people in my team in the UK who I only met for the first time yesterday because they all came into the office. They're essentially fully remote. My team is split from San Diego to New York to Miami to London, myself, but just outside of London, Reading. We've got people in Poland, the Ukraine, so I think the joy of it, as long as a company has a local entity where you're hiring, it's easy. If the company doesn't have a local entity, then it becomes a little bit more tricky. But I'm in favor of a global community. Where it is very tough, though, is in terms of meshing up the days. So, for instance, my colleagues in San Diego, I realistically only get about an hour's window with them a day. Now, that's very difficult if you're a company that isn't necessarily set up to allow for distributed strategic decisions to be made, because otherwise you try to cram in those strategic conversations in an hour, and that basically delays everything. So it's not simply that we have access to a worldwide talent pool, it's how do you structure your business to actually make best use of that? How do you distribute out strategic decisions? And that kind of goes back to that, real hardcore agile framework where you give the decision-making ability to the person on the ground, and you as a higher up get the, excuse my language, fuck out of the way. So yeah, anyways, that's my take on it.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And Memo, you're open to people working. You're obviously in Turkey at the moment, so I'm guessing as a business you make the most of being able to work remotely.
Yeah, same story as everyone. Before COVID, the office was the standard. I had a couple of 2 happy months. Oh, I can work from home. That went away quite fast. Like, put a face on the person you're talking to, building a relation becomes harder. But basically, yeah, we switched to full option of hybrid. You can either be full remote. We try to prepare events every quarter for the people to meet, but we've switched fully hybrid. You can be fully remote, fully in office, or anything in between.
Nice. Just to go back to one of the original points, that there's a question someone's just sent over to me, which they want to know who's listening in, and it was, once you move over to the cloud and once you migrate to the cloud, everything's set up and everything's been migrated, who has access to that data? So I think what's meant by that is who can access that data outside of your business, because I think this is a thing people are worried about when they come to making the move. Does anyone want to take the floor and answer that first, or?
So I can maybe try, as I've done quite a few of these migration projects. I put quite a few people on the cloud. So that's always an interesting question, like who has access to your data? So essentially, there's such thing as data governance, and we try to create the ground rules over who has roles and who has permissions over the databases that hold your data. Another thing that we like to do is to always encrypt the data at rest. This means that even the cloud providers themselves would have some difficulty accessing your actual data. So to best answer this question, if things are done right, only the owners of the data have actual access to their data or control who has access to their data. So that's the simple answer.
Nice. Is there anything anyone else would like to add on to that?
I can add. So let's say we're running on AWS. If AWS wants to break all its legal terms, all its compliance terms, and really they can. They for sure can log into your database no matter what you do, except like if they really want, they actually can. However, similarly within your team internally as an organization, you have all your compliance and security models. It always depends on eventually trusting the person, whether it's contractually or otherwise. You're doing the same thing within an organization. But yeah, it's a difficult question to answer, but yeah, you have legal agreements, all those agreements, and it goes back to the same person. You also have a team that you have legal agreements with them as individuals.
Nice. Anything to add, Paul?
I mean, I'll just echo what everybody said and kind of top it off with the fact, if you're not encrypting your data at rest in transit and your data is stored on a publicly accessible S3 bucket, well, quite frankly, anybody can access your data. The reality of it is if you architect the solution well and you understand what you're doing, only those who are supposed to have access to the data will have access to the data. As Memo said, AWS, if they wanted to, GCP, if they wanted to, they could go and somebody could essentially walk into the data center. But if you know anything about the way that these guys actually treat the data centers, because they're all physical locations at the end of the day, they are the most highly secured environments. You cannot look up the physical location of the vast majority of these. And why is that? Because they underpin the world economy currently. So, it's kind of, it can be an existential fear that you have, but it's an unrealized existential fear if you do your job correctly.
Perfect. Thank you very much all for that. And one more, this is just a question for, let's say, a business who's looking to move to the cloud. They decide to go with AWS. Let's say a year in, they decide it doesn't work for them. So is it possible, I know the answer to this question, I'm sure you'll do, is it possible for them to decide to then go ahead with Azure? And what's that process like? Is it something that can be done?
Everything's possible. Is it probable, and over what timelines? I think that's the question. Depends on how ingrained you've built the proprietary services. There's, look, the big push for big organizations is this concept of cloud agnosticism. Kubernetes has gone a long way to allow for cloud agnostic workload transferal at the end of the day, because that's working on an abstraction layer above it. Is it the most simple task in the world? No, it's not. The way that majority people would treat it is to dual run for a period in time, running workloads in both clouds until they're ready to switch over. But it's not simple. It's also not an insurmountable task.
Okay, nice. Because I know a concern speaking to businesses is if they do decide they want to change, how simple is it? And as you said, everything's possible. For another business who, I don't know, listens to this, sees something else and decides that they want to move to the cloud, they've decided which cloud platform they want to go with. When would you say the best time for any business to move to the cloud is, if they haven't already, other than now, of course?
It's tomorrow.
So tomorrow. So no, it's a good answer, because for me, there's a lot of businesses which are still on-prem who want to move to the cloud. What I want to ask is, what indications would you take that it's time to move to the cloud? Because
so you generally want to move to the cloud, or want to start thinking about moving to the cloud a year or so before your next hardware refresh cycle. This is where you want to start thinking about it, because the process of moving to the cloud is going to take some time, and you definitely want to do it before you have to change your data center again. You definitely want to save yourself that money. So if there's not an exact time to do it, that would be it. You want to tie these analysis with the hardware refresh cycle, but you don't necessarily have to. You kind of want to start the process as soon as possible, and you want to be sure to be prepared and have the process all very planned before you actually move to the cloud. So I see a lot of businesses that they start putting things on the cloud, they start doing things without having the landing zone prepared, without having the things nicely designed, and without having like a proper governance to host their workloads on the cloud. So
anything anyone wants to add on to that? Perfect. Okay, so just going back on that, Joe, thank you very much. It does lead to the original point, and it is, if you had to summarize just briefly, so why are businesses moving to the cloud? I know we've discussed the cost. I know we've discussed about being able to work for different countries, moving away from it, because initially, short term, it is going to cost the business more. So if you were speaking to a business owner now, what is the main point, the main benefit from each of you of moving to the cloud?
So I think there has been a steady growth on adopting the cloud over the past few years. There's some correlation with COVID, though I don't, as Paul said before, I don't really think it's necessarily one-to-one with COVID. I just think it's kind of, there's some correlations there, but the real reason is different. And I think the real reason is really this digital transformation trend that we see across the board. And what is digital transformation if not just using your business's data to drive business's decision? So being digital first. And this is where the cloud is really very useful, because you can put your data and have your data very easily and readily available using any of the cloud data integration tools. So for me, this would be one of the key values and one of the reasons why we're seeing people moving into the cloud this much. Although if you ask the CFO, he will still tell you it's only the cost that matters.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I would completely agree with that. And I think a good example is, you can either pay a bunch of internal engineers to write a AI/ML tool, or you can go and consume it. You can pay a bunch of engineers to cluster your SQL databases for high availability, or you can go and consume it. And so I think, that aspect of speed to market, time to value is super important. Now, whether or not a business actually ever realizes that's a whole other question, because just because you have access to the tool doesn't mean people know how to use it correctly. But that's a separate conversation.
Thank you. And Memo, what would you say the main reason for someone looking to move to cloud? What would you say the main reason to make the move is?
Not much to add, but I just thought something that, for example, in this webinar, we have 4 people from like different domains, and we barely have any kind of radically different opinions on approach, which tells you already that this model is really mature. It's kind of clear to a large extent what needs to be done. And I think if there wasn't any compliance related like topics that really prevent you from the cloud, even considering the cost, whether it's an early stage startup or at a larger scale, really for me, cloud always makes sense. One more thing is tooling, open source tooling. All companies, no matter what type of integrations, they also try to serve like the biggest clouds first. So when you go to a cloud, you can have access to all these toolings that are out of the box integrated, like with public clouds. But I wouldn't have much else to add to my colleagues.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you. just another thing which is probably more for me than anyone else. How would you describe the difference between AWS and Azure and Google Cloud? Because they obviously all do the same thing with different products, but what is the major difference between the three?
It's the same as Just Eat, Deliveroo, and potentially the new entrants to the market like Zap or Gorillas. For people in the UK, you'll kind of know what I'm talking about. I mean, they're all one and the same thing with a slightly different flavor. Like Jean mentioned, Microsoft has got its kind of focus on the Microsoft suite of products. Windows as an OS. You know, GCP's got that power of Google behind it, and some of the distributed tooling that, you know, they essentially wrote Kubernetes. It was called Borg in the day, and, you know, I mean, the Kubernetes stuff available on GCP is by far and away the best out there, in my humble opinion. AWS is the Swiss Army knife of this. Again, there's, you know, they're much in the same. It starts to get a little bit more complex as your use case gets more complex.
Yeah.
But really interesting you say that. Actually, I've heard a similar analogy previously. What you've said about Kubernetes there, I think for me, I can see from the outside in, 3 years ago or 2 years ago, to come across somebody who has commercial experience with Kubernetes, it was very, very difficult. And what I've now seen is it looks like nearly every business who's in the cloud is using Kubernetes. So what do you think that says for the future of the Google Cloud Platform? If they can bring something out as powerful as that, which has really impacted the industry, in my opinion, do you see that Google Cloud one day might be the leading provider? Because at the moment, I do find it's quite rare. It's only large enterprise businesses. It's quite big in the States at the moment as well. But across the UK, Paul, you'll probably know, other than Vodafone, HSBC, who have tried it, there's not many businesses that use it. What would you say the main reason that is, if Kubernetes is so popular? Anyone who can help me with this?
Well, I mean, essentially the fact is that Kubernetes isn't limited to GCP. I mean, you can run Kubernetes on-prem. I have. It can be an absolute nightmare. You can consume EKS, you can consume AKS, you can run native Kubernetes, you can have OpenShift clusters, both on-prem and in the cloud. So it's not, Kubernetes isn't that delimiting factor. I think your question, can GCP be the #1 player? No. No, I don't think they want to be either. I think they want a good chunk of the market share. They're primarily looking at larger organizations. I think AWS will always take a chunk of the large organization play, but then equally so, that's the entry point for a lot of businesses. And once you're within a cloud, you kind of get hooked on it, and it's difficult to move away. Azure, they have the Windows play, they have the Microsoft play. So that's you know,
because Joe, you mentioned yourself about Azure, because a lot of your customers are Microsoft Windows. I think that's quite common. I'm definitely seeing Azure being favored over AWS now. So just for yourself, have you only worked with Azure, or have you previously worked with AWS or Google Cloud?
So I've worked with all three to some extent. I do the vast majority of the work right now in Azure, because that's where we see the most demand on large organizations in Europe. Yeah. So at the end of the day, when it comes to the three clouds, you know, AWS was here first, so they have the largest share of the market. Often these type of markets are a winner takes it all type thing. Then you had Azure, which really became very popular and grew a lot because of Active Directory and Windows, but mostly really Active Directory. There's so many enterprises who are just absolutely locked into Active Directory. And then you would have GCP, which, yes, it has Kubernetes. It is really good, one of the main reasons to go there. But it came after all the other two, and you know, it's just always going to be, I think, a bit smaller.
Thank you. And Memo, have you worked with all three, or have you stayed true?
Yes, except for Google GCP, I haven't worked with it like on production. I do see that just maybe, if you look at Kubernetes, how it evolved, and kind of the problem of the actual deployment of an application interoperability is kind of solved. However, you get to talk about vendor lock-in when you're using RDS or of AWS relational managed database, or when you're using S3. Okay, my Java application or like whatever language you have has to change if I'm moving to an object storage. And also when you look at the operators evolving, you have now in Kubernetes Postgres operator written by Zalando. Maybe, just maybe, slowly things will move into cloud agnostic. Maybe in 5 to 10 years, cloud providers will be just brokers for compute power and storage. And it's just about, can go in the direction of a super dynamic, you pay for what you actually use, and services are all kind of open source. Maybe Kubernetes will be the winner in that case. But I do see it going more in that direction.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. That's something which I've always wondered. But will there come a time where you pay for what you use? Because I think that will definitely entice a lot more people, a lot of businesses who haven't already made the move. Remember, touching on something you just said there, you obviously said you'd not work with Google Cloud, but you'd work with AWS and Azure. For businesses, for recruiters, for whoever may want to know the answer to this question, because it does get asked a lot. How easy is it for somebody who's worked predominantly with AWS to move over to an Azure? How easy it be for them to move over to an Azure environment and pick up the products and tooling?
It heavily depends on the architecture. For example, if your company already decides by default everything should run in a Kubernetes cluster, except let's say we don't manage storage for production data by ourselves, we use RDS. In such a scenario, moving to Azure will be very simple. If a company, for example, is using serverless features and basically everything is kind of vendor specific, then it becomes harder. But overall, they are really, really ridiculously similar. And specifically for my case, I heavily, exclusively like don't touch UI. I just work in Terraform. When you speak in these terms, it gets even simpler. But I don't see it as like a steep learning curve if you have good experience in AWS and would like to move to Azure, and vice versa.
Okay, so if you were hiring and somebody had predominantly experience with Azure and you were hiring for an AWS role, you would consider them, or?
I genuinely wouldn't even care.
Yeah, okay,
like
that's really interesting.
Even my questions in the interviews, like, what is immutable infrastructure? What is, it's just about concepts. Since we also, in our case, like most of things go into Kubernetes, except for really sensitive storage of data, it really doesn't matter for us by now.
Okay. And Joe, I'll ask you a question. It was just mentioned there about if it's serverless. So for somebody who is not a techie themselves, what would it mean for your cloud capabilities to be serverless? I know the difference, obviously, Linux and Windows, sorry. But what is serverless then?
What is serverless? So that's a really good question. And I would qualify serverless as a resource, an offering, or a service where you can host your code and not have to worry about infrastructure at all. This is how I would qualify serverless. Different people have sort of different definitions. You could hear someone qualify serverless as someone or a service that lets you host data without you having to write any code whatsoever. I don't really see it like that. And this is more or less how I would see serverless.
Okay. And again, what are the benefits of serverless?
So serverless, again, lets you not worry about infrastructure, and generally they operate on elastic models. So if you have just a couple of requests, you pay a lot less than you have millions of requests, and you generally just don't worry about infrastructure. This is the main benefits of serverless environment.
Yeah, nice, thank you. Anything to add, Paul?
No, not really. I think they kind of covered it. I mean, it just gives developers access to what they need at the end of the day. But it can't solve every use case, but it's a good methodology where needed. Like lots of automation is written calling serverless, just because you just
Yeah.
it's an in-time action. You know, why maintain a VM, an EC2 instance when you can just literally call an in-time action?
Perfect. Thank you. Well, look, we're going to get coming to the end now. It's just I personally am going to come off this much more knowledgeable, as I've got the answer to a lot of questions I've wanted to know for a while. If just quickly, if you all just want to summarize the importance, because the question and topic itself is the importance of moving to the cloud. I know we've gone over it a few times. If you want to just summarize the importance in a couple of sentences each, Memo, we'll start with you.
I'm like a cloud enthusiast, so obviously I will encourage businesses and will encourage, try it out, you know, create your own like VPC network, deploy just one application there, live the experience, and then decide whether maybe taking a decision of like, let's move to AWS, my entire company, maybe would be too much. Maybe start with, let's deploy one new service that we're developing to the cloud first and see how it goes. And yeah, I guess we've spoken about all like things that could benefit the business.
Perfect. And Zhao, how would you summarize the importance of moving quickly for a business that's deciding to make the move at the moment?
So I say that the cloud right now is the most secure, most cost-effective, and most agile way to host infrastructure. And because of this, it just makes so much sense. Just really the obvious step forward when growing your business. So for me, this is the main reason why you should move to the cloud.
Perfect, thank you. And finally, Paul, I don't mean to keep putting you last, don't worry.
It works for me, man. Look, I'll steal Nike's old strap line, just do it.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. Well, look, all three of you and everyone else has come in. Thank you very much for your time. I've actually really enjoyed this. I've come out of it with different perspective on a few things. And I'm hoping the knowledge that you've shared can help others. But yeah, thank you very much, all three of you for your thoughts, and everyone else that joined us today on the Zoom. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good one. Thanks for having.
Have a nice day.
Ciao.
Cheers.
Yes, bye-bye.
Thanks.